Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. What is happening to Shirley? In this episode, brave Shirley Hollister shows the ingenuity of Nancy Drew and the courage of a valiant knight as she does her best to protect her top-secret shorthand notes from being taken by a gang of ruthless criminals. Her quick-witted strategies soon involve Sidney Graham as well as her little sister Carol. In the middle of this very trying situation, Shirley relies on her one true source of comfort to help her through. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 22. Shirley's sense of direction had always been keen. Even as a child, she could tell her way home when others were lost. It was some minutes, however, before she suddenly became aware that the car was being driven in an entirely different direction from the place where she had just left Mr. Barnard. For a moment she looked around puzzled, thinking the man was merely taking another way around. But a glance back where the white dome of the Capitol loomed, palace-like above the city, made her sure that something was wrong. She looked at the buildings they were passing, at the names of the streets. F Street. They had not been on that before. These stores and tall buildings were all new to her eyes. Down there at the end of the vista was a great building, all columns. Was that the Treasury? And were they merely seeing it from another angle? It was all very confusing, but the time was short. Why then had the man not taken the shorter way? She looked at her small wristwatch anxiously and watched eagerly for the end of the street. But before the great building was reached, the car suddenly curved around a corner to the right. 1 block, a turn to the left, another turn, a confusion of new names and streets. New York Avenue, Connecticut Avenue, Thomas Circle. The names spun by so fast she could read but a few of them, and those she saw she wanted to remember, that she might weave them into her next postal. She opened her bag, fumbled for her little silver pencil in the pocket of her coat, and scribbled down the names she could read as she passed. On the back of the bundle of postal cards, and without looking at her writing, she did not wish to miss a single sight. Here were rows of homes, pleasant and palatial, some of them even cozy. The broad avenues were enchanting, the park spaces, the lavish scattering of noble statues. But the time was hastening by, and they were going farther and farther from the station, and from the direction of the offices where she had been. She twisted her neck once more, and the Capitol dome loomed soft and blended in the distance. A thought of alarm leaped into her mind. She leaned forward and spoke to the driver. "You understood, didn't you, that I am to return to the office where you took me with the gentleman?" The man nodded. "All right, lady, yes, lady," and the car rushed on, leaping out upon the beautiful way and disclosing new beauties ahead. For a few minutes more Shirley was distracted from her anxiety in wondering whether the great buildings on her right belonged to any of the embassies or not. And then, as the car swerved and plunged into another street, and darted into a less thickly populated district, with trees and vacant lots almost like the country, alarm arose once more, and she looked wildly back and tried to see the signs. But they were going faster still now, upon a wide, empty road, past stretches of parks, with winding drives and charming views, and a great stone bridge to the right, arching over a deep ravine below, a railroad crossing. There were deer parks fenced with high wire and filled with the pretty creatures. Everything went by so fast that Shirley hardly realized that something really must be wrong before she seemed to be in the midst of a strange world, aloof. "I'm sure you've made a mistake," the girl's clear voice cut through the driving wind as they rushed along. "I must go back right away to that office from which you brought me. I must go at once, or I shall be too late for my train. The gentleman will be very angry." She spoke in the tone that always brought instant obedience from the employees around the office building at home. But the driver was stolid. He scarcely stirred in his seat to turn toward her. His thick voice was brought back to her on the breeze. "No, it's all right, lady. I had my orders, lady. You needn't to worry, I'll get you there plenty time." A wild fear seized Shirley, and her heart lifted itself, as was its habit, to God. "Oh, my Father, take care of me, help me, show me what to do," she cried. Thoughts rushed through her brain as fast as the car rushed over the ground. What was she up against? Was this man crazy or bad? Was he perhaps trying to kidnap her? What for? She shuddered to look the thought in the face. Or was it the notes? She remembered the men in the office and what they had said about keeping still and spying enemies. But perhaps she was mistaken. Maybe this man was only slow in the brain, and it would all come out all right in a few minutes. But no, she must not wait for anything like that. She must take no chance. The notes were in her keeping. She must put them where they would be safe. No telling how soon she would be overpowered and searched, if that was what they were after. She must hide them, and she must think of some way to send word to Mr. Barnard before it was too late. No telling what moment they would turn from the main road, and she be hidden far from human habitation. She must work fast. What could she do? Scream to the next passer-by? No, for the car was going too fast for that to do any good, and the houses up this way seemed all to be so isolated, and few people about. There were houses on ahead beyond the park. She must have something ready to throw out when they came to them. "Oh, God, help me think what to do," she prayed again, and then, looking down at her bag, she saw the postal cards. Just the thing. Quickly she scribbled, still holding her hand within the bag, so that her movements were not noticeable. "Help! Quick! Being carried off! Auto! Connecticut Avenue! Park! Deer! Stonebridge! Phone Mr. Clegg! Don't tell Mother! Shirley." She drew a line through her mother's name and wrote Carol's in its place. Stealthily, she slipped the card up her sleeve, dropped her hand carelessly over the side of the car for a moment, let the card flutter from her fingers, and wrote another. She had written 3 cards and dropped them in front of houses before it suddenly occurred to her that even if these cards should be picked up and mailed, it would be some time before they reached their destination, and far too late for help to reach her in time. Her heart suddenly went down into a swooning sickness, and her breath almost went from her. Her head was reeling, and all the time she was trying to tell herself that she was exaggerating this thing, that probably the man would slow up or something, and it would all be explained. Yes, he was slowing up. But for what? It was in another lonely spot, and out from the bushes there appeared, as if by magic, another man. A queer-looking man with a heavy mustache that looked as if it didn't belong to him. He stood alertly, waiting for the car, and sprang into the front seat, without waiting for it to stop, or even glancing back at her. And the car shot forward again, with great leaps. Shirley dropped out the 2 cards together that she had just written, and leaned forward, touching the newcomer on the arm. "Won't you please make this driver understand that he's taking me to the wrong place?" she said with a pleasant smile. "I must get back to an office building, 2 or 3 blocks away from the Treasury building somewhere. I must turn back at once, or I shall miss my appointment and be late for my train. It is quite important. Tell him, please. I will pay him well if he will get me back at once." The stranger turned with an oily smile. "That's all right, miss. He isn't making any mistake. We're taking you right to Secretary Baker's country home. He sent for your man, Mr. What's his name? I forget. Oh, Barnard. Oh, yes, he sent for Mr. Barnard to come out there. Sent his private car down for him. And Mr. Barnard, he left orders we should go after you and bring you along. It's something they want to change in those notes you was taking. There was a mistake, and the secretary, he wanted to look after the matter himself." Shirley sat back with a sudden feeling of weakness and a fear she might faint, although she had never done such a thing in her life. She was not deceived for an instant now, although she saw at once that she must not let the man know it. The idea that Secretary Baker would pause in the midst of his multiplicity of duties to look into the details of a small article of manufacture was ridiculous. It was equally impossible that Mr. Barnard would have sent strangers after her and let her be carried off in this queer way. He had been most particular that she should be looked after carefully. She was horribly to blame that she had allowed herself to be carried back at all until Mr. Barnard himself appeared. And yet, was she? That surely had been the page from the office who came with the message. Well, never mind, she was in for it now, and she must do her best while there was any chance to do anything. She must drop all those postcards somehow, and she must hide those notes somewhere, and perhaps write some others, fake ones. Oh, what should she do? "Father, help me, show me. Oh, don't let me lose the notes. Please take care of me." Again and again her heart prayed as her hand worked stealthily in her bag, while she tried to put a pleasant smile upon her face and pretend she was still deceived, leaning forward and speaking to the strange man once more. "Is Secretary Baker's home much farther from here?" she asked, feeling her lips draw stiffly in the frozen smile she forced. "Will it take long?" "'Bout 10 minutes, the man answered graciously, with a peculiar look toward the driver. "Nice view around here," he added affably, with a leering look of admiration toward her. Shirley's heart stood still with new fear, but she managed to make her white lips smile again and murmur, "Charming." Then she leaned back again and fussed around in her bag, ostentatiously bringing out a clean handkerchief, though she really had been detaching the pages which contained the notes from her loose-leaf notebook. There were not many of them, for she always wrote closely in small characters. But where should she hide them? Pull the lining away from the edge of her bag and slip them inside? No, for the bag would be the first place they would likely search, and she could not poke the lining back smoothly so it would not show. If she should try to drop the tiny pages down her neck, inside her blouse, the men would very likely see her. Dared she try to slip the leaves down under the linen robe that lay over her lap and put them inside her shoe? She was wearing plain little black pumps, and the pages would easily go in the soles, 3 or 4 in each. Once in, they would be well hidden, and they would not rattle and give notice of their presence. But, oh, what a terrible risk if anything should happen to knock off her shoe! Or if they should try to search her. Still, she must take some risk, and this was the safest risk at hand. She must try it, and then write out some fake notes, giving false numbers and sizes and other phraseology. Or stay! Wasn't there already something written in that book that would answer? Some specifications she had written down for the Tillman Brooks Company. Yes, she was sure. It wasn't at all for the same articles, nor the same measurements. But only an expert would know that. She leaned down quite naturally to pick up her handkerchief, and deftly managed to get 5 small leaves slipped into her right shoe. It occurred to her that she must keep her keepers deceived, so she asked once more in gracious tones, "Would it trouble you any to mail a card for me as soon as possible after we arrive? I'm afraid my mother will be worried about my delay, and she isn't well. I suppose they have a post office out this way." "Sure, miss," said the man again, with another leering smile that made her resolve to have no further conversation than was absolutely necessary. She took out her fountain pen and hurriedly wrote, "Detained longer than I expected. May not get back tonight. S.H." and handed the card to the man. He took it and turned it over, all too evidently reading it, and put it in his pocket. Shirley felt that she had made an impression of innocence by the move, which so far was good. She put away her fountain pen deliberately, and managed in so doing to manipulate the rest of the leaves of notes into her left shoe. Somehow that gave her a little confidence, and she sat back and began to wonder if there was anything more she could do. Those dropped postals were worse than useless, of course. Why had she not written an appeal to whoever picked them up? Suiting the action to the thought, she wrote another postal card. Her stock was getting low. There were but 2 more left. "For Christ's sake, send the police to help me. I am being carried off by 2 strange men. Shirley Hollister." She marked out the address on the other side and wrote, "To whoever picks this up." She fluttered it to the breeze cautiously, but her heart sank as she realized how little likelihood there was of its being picked up for days perhaps. For who would stop in a car to notice a bit of paper on the road? And there seemed to be but few pedestrians. If she only had something larger, more attractive. She glanced at her belongings and suddenly remembered the book she had brought with her to read. One of the new novels from the cottage, a goodly-sized volume in a bright red cover, the very thing. With a cautious glance at her keepers, she took up the book as if to read, and opening it at the flyleaf, began to write surreptitiously much the same message that had been on her last postal, signing her name and home address, and giving her employer's address. Her heart was beating wildly when she had finished. She was trying to think just how she should use this last bit of ammunition to the best advantage. Should she just drop it in the road quietly? If only there were some way to fasten the pages open, so her message would be read. Her handkerchief, of course! She folded it cornerwise and slipped it in across the pages so that the book would fall open at the flyleaf, knotting the ends on the back of the cover. Every moment had to be cautious, and she must remember to keep her attitude of reading, with the printed pages covering the handkerchief. It seemed hours that it took. Her fingers trembled so. If it had not been for the rushing noise of wind and car, she would not have dared so much undiscovered. But apparently her captors were satisfied that she still believed their story about going to Secretary Baker's country house, for they seemed mainly occupied in watching to see if they were pursued, casting anxious glances back now and then, but scarcely noticing her at all. Shirley had noticed 2 or 3 times, when a car had passed them, that the men both leaned down to do something at their feet to the machinery of the car. Were they afraid of being recognized? Would this perhaps give her a chance to fling her book out where it would be seen by people in an oncoming car? Oh, if she had but the strength and skill to fling it into a car! But of course that was impossible without attracting the attention of the 2 men. Nevertheless, she must try what she could do. She lifted her eyes to the road, and lo, ahead of them, a big car was bearing down upon them. She had almost despaired of meeting any more, for the road was growing more and more lonely, and they must have come many miles. As soon as the 2 men in front of her sighted the car, they seemed to settle in their seats and draw their hats down a little farther over their eyes. The same trouble seemed to develop with the machinery at their feet that Shirley had noticed before, and they bobbed and ducked and seemed to be wholly engrossed with their own affairs. Shirley's heart was beating so fast that it seemed as though it would suffocate her, and her hand seemed powerless as it lay innocently holding the closed book with the knotted handkerchief turned down out of sight. But she was girding herself, nerving herself for one last great effort, and praying to be guided. The big car came on swiftly and was about to pass, when Shirley half rose and hurled her book straight at it, and then sank back in her seat with a fearful terror upon her, closing her eyes for one brief second, not daring to watch the results of her act, if there were to be any results. The men in the front seat suddenly straightened up and looked around. "What's the matter?" growled the man, in quite a different tone from any he had used before. "What's you trying to put over on us?" Shirley gasped and caught at her self-control. I've dropped my book," she stammered out wildly. Could you stop long enough to pick it up? It was borrowed," she ended sweetly, as if by inspiration, and wondered at the steadiness of her tone, when blood was pounding so in her throat and ears, and everything was black before her. Perhaps she could cry out to the people for help. The man rose up in his seat and looked back. Shirley cast one frightened glance back too, and saw in that brief second that the other car had stopped, and someone was standing up and looking back. "Hell no!" her captor said briefly, ducking down in his seat. "Don't let her out!" he howled to the driver. And the car broke into a galloping streak, the wheels hardly seeming to touch the ground, the vehicle bounding and swaying this way and that. Shirley had all she could do to keep in her seat. At one moment she thought how easy it would be to spring from the car and lie in a little still heap at the roadside. But there were the notes. She must not abandon her trust even for so fearful an escape from her captors. Suddenly, without warning, they turned a sharp curve and struck into a rough, almost unbroken road into the woods, and the thick growth seemed to close in behind them and shut them out from the world. Shirley closed her eyes and prayed. Chapter 23. The next trolley that passed the old barn after the Hollisters had left brought a maidservant and a manservant from the Graham place. The other old servant met them, and together the three went to work. They had brought with them a lot of large dust covers and floor spreads, such as are used by housemaids in cleaning a room, and with these they now proceeded to cover all the large pieces of furniture in the place. In a very short space of time, the rugs and bits of carpet were carefully rolled up, the furniture piled in small compass in the middle of the rooms, and everything enveloped in thick coverings. The curtains, bric-a-brac, and even the dishes were put away carefully, and the whole big, inviting home was suddenly denuded. The clothes from the calico-curtained clothes presses were folded and laid in drawers, and everything was made perfectly safe for a lot of workmen to come into the house. Even the hayloft bedrooms shared in this process. Only a cot was left for the old servant, and a few necessary things for him to use, and most of these he transported to the basement out of the way. When the work was done, the man and maid took the trolley back home again, and the other old manservant arranged to make his Sabbath as pleasant as possible in the company of his brother from the nearby farm. Monday morning, promptly at 8 o'clock, the trolley landed a bevy of workmen, carpenters, plasterers, plumbers, and furnace-men, with a foreman who set them all at work as if it were a puzzle he had studied out and memorized the solution. In a short time the quiet spot was full of sound, the symphony of industry, the rhythm of toil. Some men were working away with the furnace that had been stored in the cellar. Others were measuring, fitting, cutting holes for lead pipes. Still others were sawing away at the roof, making great gashes in its mossy extent, and 2 men were busy taking down the old barn door. Out in front, more men were building a vat for mortar and opening bags of lime and sand that began to arrive. 3 men with curious aprons made of ticking, filled with thin wire nails, were frantically putting up laths on the uprights that the carpenters had already set up, and stabbing them with nails from a seemingly inexhaustible supply in their mouths. It was as if they had all engaged to build the Tower of Babel in a day, and meant to win a prize at it. Such sounds! Such shouting, such bangings, thumpings, and hard raucous noises! The bird in the tall tree looked and shivered, thankful that her brood were well away on their wings before all this cataclysm came to pass. Presently arrived a load of sashes, doors, and window frames, and another load of lumber. Things can be done in a hurry if you have money and influence, and the will to insist upon what you want. Before night, there was a good start made toward big changes in the old barn. Plumbers and gas fitters and men who were putting in the hot water heat chased one another around the place, each man seeking to get his pipes in place before the lathers got to that spot, and the contractor was everywhere, proving his right to be selected for this rush job. As soon as the lathers had finished with a room, the plasterers took possession, and the old door was rapidly being replaced with a great glazed door set in a frame of more sashes, so that the old darkness was gone entirely. In the roof, big dormer windows were taking the place of the 2 or 3 little eyebrow affairs that had given air to the hay heretofore, and the loft was fast becoming pleasanter than the floor below. Outside laborers were busy putting up a terrace, where a wide cement floor piazza with stone foundations and low stone walls was to run across the entire front. Another chimney was rising from the region of the kitchen. A white enamel sink with a wide drain shelf attached appeared next, with signs of a butler's pantry between kitchen and dining room. A delightful set of china closet doors with little diamond panes that matched the windows was put in one corner of the dining room, and some bookcases with sliding doors began to develop along the walls of the living room. Down in the basement, a man was fitting stationary tubs for a laundry, and on both the first floor and the second, bathrooms were being made. If the place hadn't been so big, the workmen would have got in one another's way. Closets big and little were being put in, and parts of a handsome staircase were lying about, until you wouldn't know the place at all. Every evening the old servant and the neighbor next door, who used to rent the old barn before he built his own new one, came together to look over what had been accomplished during the day, and to discourse upon this changing world and the wonders of it. The farmer, in fact, learned a great deal about modern improvements, and at once set about bringing some of them to bear upon his own modest farmhouse. He had money in the bank, and why shouldn't he have things convenient for Sally? When Sidney Graham reached the city on Monday morning, he scarcely took time to read his mail in the office and give the necessary attention to the day's work, before he was up and off again, flying along the Glenside Road as fast as his car would carry him. His mind certainly was not on business that morning. He was as eager as a child to see how work at the old barn was progressing, and the workmen stood small chance of lying down on their job that week, for he meant to make every minute count, no matter how much it cost. He spent a large part of Monday hovering about the old barn, gloating over each new sign of progress, using his imagination on more things than the barn. But when Tuesday arrived, an accumulation of work at the office in connection with a large order that had just come in kept him close to his desk. He had hoped to get away in time to reach Glenside before the workmen left in the afternoon. But 4 o'clock arrived, with still a great pile of letters for him to sign, before his work would be done for the day. He had just signed his name for the 49th time and laid his pen down with an impatient sigh of relief when the telephone on his desk rang. He hesitated. Should he answer it and be hindered again, or call his secretary and let her attend to it while he slipped away to his well-earned respite? A second insistent ring, however, brought him back to duty, and he reached out and took up the receiver. "Is this Mr. Sidney Graham? Long distance is calling." The young man frowned impatiently and wished he had sent for his secretary. It was probably another tiresome confab on that Chicago matter, and it really wasn't worth the trouble anyway. Then a small, scared voice at the other end of the wire spoke. Is that you, Mr. Graham? Well, this is Carol. Say, Mr. Graham, I'm afraid something awful has happened to Shirley. I don't know what to do, and I thought I'd better ask you." Her voice broke off in a gasp like a sob. A cold chill struck at the young man's heart, and a vision of Shirley battling with the ocean waves was instantly conjured up. "Shirley, where is she? Tell me, quick," he managed to say, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. She's down at Washington," answered Carol. "Mr. Barnard phoned her last night. There was something special nobody else could take notes about, because it was for a government contract and has to be secret. Mr. Barnard asked her to please go, and she went this morning. Mother didn't like her to go, but she addressed a lot of postal cards for her to write back, and one came postmarked Baltimore in this afternoon's mail, saying she was having a nice time, but just now a call came for Mother to go to the telephone. She was asleep, and George was crabbing, so I had to come. It was a strange man in Washington. He said he had just found 3 postal cards on the road addressed to Mother, and that all said, 'Help! Quick! 2 men were carrying off Shirley, and please to phone to the police.' He took the postals to the police station, but he thought he ought to phone us, and, oh, Mr. Graham, what shall I do? I can't tell Mother. It will kill her. And how can we help Shirley?" "You're right. Don't tell Mother," said Graham quickly, trying to speak calmly out of his horror. "Be a brave girl, Carol. A great deal depends on you just now. Have you phoned Mr. Barnard? Oh, you say he's in Washington? He was to meet your sister in Baltimore? He did meet her, you say? The postal card said she had met him. Well, the next thing is to phone Mr. Clegg and find out if he knows anything. I'll do that at once. And unless he has heard that she's all right, I will start for Washington on the next train. Suppose you stay right where you are till 5:30. I may want to call you up again and need you in a hurry. Then you go back to the cottage as fast as you can and talk cheerfully. Say you went to take a walk. Isn't Elizabeth with you? Well, tell her to help keep your mother from suspecting anything. Above all things, don't cry. It won't do any good, and it may do lots of harm. Get George off by himself and tell him everything, and tell him I said he was to make some excuse to go downtown after supper and stay at the telephone office until 10 o'clock. I may want to call him up from Washington. Now be a brave girl. I suspect your sister Shirley would tell you to pray. Goodbye." "I will," gasped Carol. "Goodbye." Graham pressed his foot on the bell under his desk and reached out to slam his desk drawers shut and put away his papers. His secretary appeared at the door. "Please get me Barnard and Clegg on the phone. Ask for Mr. Barnard, or, if he isn't in, for Mr. Clegg. Then go out to the other phone and call up the station. Find out what's the next express to Washington. Tell Bromwell to be ready to drive me to the station and bring my car back to the garage." He was working rapidly as he talked, putting papers in the safe, jotting down a few notes for the next day's work, trying to think of everything at once. The secretary handed him the phone, quietly saying, "Mr. Clegg on the phone," and went out of the room. Excited conference with Mr. Clegg brought out the fact that he was but just in receipt of a telegram from police headquarters in Washington, saying that a book with Barnard and Clegg's address and an appeal from a young woman named Shirley Hollister, who was apparently being kidnapped by two strange men in an auto, had been flung into a passing car and brought to them. They had sent forces in search of the girl at once, and would do all in their power to find her. Meantime, they would like any information that would be helpful in the search. Mr. Clegg was much excited. He appeared to have lost his head. He seemed glad to have another cooler mind at work on the case. He sputtered a good deal about the importance of the case and the necessity for secrecy. He said he hoped it wouldn't get into the papers, and that it would be Barnard and Clegg's undoing if it did. He seemed more concerned about that and the notes that Shirley probably had than about the girl's situation. When Graham brought him up sharply, he admitted that there had been a message from Barnard, that he would be detained overnight probably, but he attached no significance to that. He knew Barnard's usual hotel address in Washington, but hadn't thought to phone him about the telegram from police headquarters. Graham hung up at last in a panic of fury and dismay, ringing violently for his secretary again. "The next train leaves at 5 o'clock, she said capably as she entered. "Bromwell has gone after the car. I told him to buy you a mileage book and save your time at this end. You have 40 minutes, and he will be back in plenty of time." "Good," said Graham. "Now call up long distance and get me police headquarters in Washington. No, use the phone in Father's office, please. I'll have to use this while you're getting them." As soon as she had left the room, he called up the shore again, and was fortunate in getting Carol almost immediately, the poor child being close at hand, all in a tremble, with Elizabeth in no less a state of nervousness, brave and white, waiting for orders. "Can you give me an exact description of your sister's dress, and everything that she had with her when she started this morning?" asked Graham, prepared with pen and paper to write it down. Carol summoned her wits and described Shirley's simple outfit exactly, even down to the little black pumps on her feet, and went mentally through the small handbag she had carried. "Oh, yes," she added, "and she had a book to read, one she found here in the cottage. It had a red cover and was called From the Car Behind." Graham wrote them all down carefully, and asked a few more details of Shirley's plans, and bade Carol again to be brave and go home with a message to George, to be at the phone from 8:30 to 10. He was all ready to go to his train when the Washington call came in, and as he hurried to his father's office to answer it, he found his heart crying out to an unseen power to help him in this trying hour, and protect the sweet girl in awful peril. "Oh, God, I love her," he found his heart saying over and over again, as if it had started out to be an individual by itself, without his will or volition. There was no comfort from Washington Police Headquarters. Nothing more had been discovered save another crumpled postal card, lying along the roadside. They received with alacrity, however, Mr. Barnard's Washington hotel address and the description of the young woman and her belongings. When Graham had finished the hasty conversation, he had to fly to make his train, and when at last he lay back in his seat in the parlor car and let the waves of his anxiety and trouble roll over him, he was almost overwhelmed. He had led a comparatively tranquil life for a young man who had never tried to steer clear of trouble, and this was the first great calamity that had ever come his way. Calamity? No, he would not own yet that it was a calamity. He was hurrying to her. He would find her. He would not allow himself to think that anything had befallen her. But wherever she was, if she was still alive, no matter how great her peril, he was sure she was praying now, and he would pray too. Yes, pray as she had taught him. Oh, God, if he only knew how to pray better. What was it she had said so often? "Whatsoever ye ask in my name." Yes, that was it. "I will do it." What was that talismanic name? Ah, Christ! O God, in the name of Christ! But when he came to the thought of her, she was too exquisite and too dear to be put into words. So his petition went up in spirit form, unframed by words to weigh it down, wafted up by the pain of a soul in torture. At Baltimore, it occurred to Graham to send a telegram to Barnard to meet him at the train, and when he got out at Union Station, the first person he saw was Barnard, white and haggard, looking for him through the bars of the train gate. He grasped the young man's hand as if it were a last straw for a drowning man to cling to, and demanded in a shaking voice to know if he had heard anything from Miss Hollister. One of the first questions that Graham asked was whether Barnard had been back to the office where Miss Hollister had taken the dictation to report her disappearance.
"Well, no, I hadn't thought of that," said Barnard blankly. "What would they know about it? The fact is, I was rather anxious to keep the facts from getting to them. You see, they warned me that there were parties anxious to get a hold of those specifications. It's government work, you know."
"They should know at once," said Graham sternly. "They may have inside information which would give us a clue to follow. The Secret Service men are onto a lot of things that we common mortals don't suspect." Mr. Barnard looked mortified and convinced. "Well, what have you done so far? We would better understand each other thoroughly, so as to save time and not go over old ground. You've been in communication with police headquarters, of course?" asked Graham.
"Why, no," said the older man apologetically. "You see, I got here just in time for the train, and failing to find the young lady in that station where we agreed to meet, I took it for granted that she had used the extra time in driving about to see a few sights in the city as I suggested, and had somehow failed to get back in time. I couldn't understand it, because she had been quite anxious to get home tonight. I could have caught the train myself, but didn't exactly like to leave her alone in a strange city, though of course it's perfectly safe for a steady girl like that. Afterward it occurred to me that she might have gotten on the train, and perhaps I should have done so too. But there was really very little time to decide, for the train pulled out 2 minutes after I reached the station. I waited here for a time, and then went over to the Continental, where my sister is stopping, thinking I would ask her to stay in the station and watch for the young lady, and I would go home. But I found my sister had run down to the shore for a few days, so I had something to eat, and while I was in the dining room your telegram came. I was hoping somehow you had seen Miss Hollister, or had word from her, and it was all right." One could see the poor man had no conception of what was due to a lady in his care, and Graham looked at him for a moment with rage, wishing he could take him by the throat and shake some sense into him. "Then you don't know she's been kidnapped, and the police are out on track for her," said Graham dryly. "Oh, no, you don't say!"
exclaimed Barnard, turning white and showing he had some real feeling after all.
"Kidnapped? Why, how could she? And she's got those notes. Why, Graham, you're fooling. Why, how came you to know?"
Graham told him tersely as he walked the man over to the telephone booths, and finished with, "Now you go into that booth and phone your government man, and I'll call up police headquarters and see what's happening. We've got to work fast, for there's no telling what may have happened in the last 3 hours. It's up to us to find that girl before anything worse happens to her." White and trembling, Barnard tottered into the booth. When he came out again, the sleuth-hounds of the Secret Service were on the trail of Shirley Hollister's captors. Chapter 24. The car that was bearing Shirley Hollister through the lonely wooded road at a breathless speed suddenly came to a halt in the rear of an old house whose front faced on another road equally lonely. During the brief time that they had been in the woods, the sky seemed to have perceptibly darkened with the coming evening. Shirley looked about her with increased fright. It was almost night, and here was her prison, far from town or human dwelling place. Even the road was at some distance in front of the house, and there were more woods on either side.
"This here is Secretary Baker's summer home," announced the man who had done the talking, as he climbed out of the car and opened the door for her. "You can just step in the back door and go through to the parlor. The help's all out this afternoon. The secretary'll be down presently. He always takes a nap afternoons about this time. I'll tell him you've come."
There seemed nothing to do but obey, and Shirley chose to let the farce continue. Surely the man must know she was not a fool. But it was better than open hostility. There was nothing to be gained by informing him that she knew he was guying her. "Oh, Jesus Christ, I trust myself to you," she breathed in her heart, as she stepped across the leaf-strewn grass and looked about her, wondering whether she should ever walk the earth again after she had stepped into the dim, tree-shrouded house. But why go in? "I think I will remain out here," she said calmly, albeit her heart was pounding away like a trip-hammer. "Please tell Mr. Baker to come to me here. It is much pleasanter than in the house on a day like this."
"Ah, no, you won't neither. The secretary don't receive in the open air, even in summer," drawled the man,
and she noticed that he and the driver straightened up and stepped closer to her, one on either side. She gave one wild glance toward the open space. There was simply no chance at all to run away, even if she succeeded in eluding them at the start by a quick, unexpected dash. They were alert, athletic men, and no telling how many more were hidden in the house. "Oh, very well, of course, if it's a matter of etiquette," said Shirley pleasantly, determined to keep up the farce as long as possible. A cold, dark air met the girl as she stepped within the creaking door and looked about her. At her left was an old-fashioned kitchen, dusty and cobwebby. A long, narrow hall led to the front of the house, and her guide pointed her toward a room on the right. There was something hollow and eerie in the sound of their footsteps on the old oaken floor. The room into which she was ushered was musty and dusty as the rest. The floor was covered with an ancient ingrain carpet. The table was covered with a magenta felt cover, stamped with a vine of black leaves, and riddled with moth-holes. The walls were hung with old prints and steel engravings, suspended by woolen cords and tassels. The furniture was dilapidated. Everything was covered with dust, but there were finger marks in the dust here and there that showed the place had been recently visited. Through the open doorway, an old square piano was visible in what must be the parlor. The place seemed to Shirley fairly teeming with memories of some family now departed. She leapt to the quick conclusion that the house had been long deserted, and had only recently been entered and used as a rendezvous for illegal conferences. It occurred to her that there might be an opportunity for her to hide the precious papers somewhere safely, if it came to it that she must be searched. How about that piano? Could she slip some of them between the keys? But it was hardly likely that there would be an opportunity for anything like that. She felt strangely calm as she looked about upon her prison.
He ain't come yet," remarked her guide as he glanced into the front room. "Well, you can set down. He won't be long now. Joe, you just look about a bit and see if you can find the secretary, and tell him the young lady's here."
The man flung himself full length on the carpet-covered couch and looked at her with satisfaction.
"What train was that you said you must make? I'm afraid now you might be going to be just a trifle late if you don't get a hustle on. But you can't hurry a great man like that, you know."
"Oh, it's no matter," said Shirley coolly, looking around her with the utmost innocence. "What a quaint old house. Has it been in the family a long time?" The man looked at her amusedly.
"You're a cute one," he remarked affably. "I believe you're a pretty good sport. You know perfectly well you're in my power and can't do a turn to help yourself, but yet you sail around here just as calm as a queen. You're some looker, too. Blamed if I'm not enjoying myself. I wouldn't mind a kiss or two from those pretty lips."
But Shirley had melted through the doorway into the other room, and her voice floated back with charming indifference, as if she had not heard. though she was ready to scream with loathing and fear of the man. "Why, isn't this a delightful old piano? The keys are actually mother of pearl. Isn't it odd? Would Mr. Baker mind if I played on it?" And before her astonished captor could get himself to the doorway, she had sat down on the rickety old haircloth stool and swept the keys lightly. The old chords trembled and shivered as if awaking from a tomb, and uttered forth a quavering, sweet sound, like ancient memories. The man was too much astonished to stop her, amused too, perhaps, and interested. Her white fingers over the dusty pearls in the growing dusk had a strange charm for the hardened reprobate, like the wonder of a flower dropped into the foulness of a prison. Before he could recover, he was startled again by her voice, soaring out in the empty, echoing house. "Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy riven side which flowed be of sin the double cure. Save me, Lord, and make me pure." Perhaps those dim, gloomy walls had echoed before to the grand old tune, but never could it have been sung in more dire straits, or with a more earnest cry from a soul in distress. She had chosen the first words that seemed to fit the chords which she had struck, but every syllable was a prayer to the God in whom she trusted. It may be the man felt the power of her appeal as he stood rooted in the doorway, and listened while she sang through all the verses she could remember. But the last trembling note was broken harshly by Joe's voice at the kitchen door in sharp, rasping orders. "Hist there! Can that noise. Do you want to raise hell here? Wake up, Sam. Get on to your job. Henny's coming." "That's all right, Joe. Dry up. This is good Sunday school dope. This won't rouse no suspicions. Go to the devil and mind your business. I know what I'm about." Shirley was almost ready to cry, but she drew a deep breath and started on another song. "Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is nigh. Hide me, O my Saviour, hide, till the storm of life is past. Safe into the haven guide, O receive my soul at last." On through the time-worn words she sang, while the sin-hardened man stood silently and listened. His eyes had gradually lost their leer and grown soft and tender, as if some childhood memories of home and mother, and a time when he was innocent and good, were looking out his eyes, reminding him of what he once intended to be, before he ate the apple of wisdom and became as the gods and devils. Shirley gradually became aware that she was holding her strange audience, and a power beyond herself steadied her voice and kept her fingers from trembling on the old pearl keys as she wandered on from song to song, happening on the very ones, who knows, that this man, standing in the dying twilight of the old gloomy house, had sung beside his mother's hearth or in church during his childhood. Certain it is that he stood there silent and listened for at least half an hour without an interruption, while the light in the big room grew dimmer and dimmer, and all about the house seemed still as death in the intervals between her voice. She was just beginning, "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide, the darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, O thou who changest not, abide with me. When the man put his hand in his pocket and brought out a candle, scratching a match on his trousers, he lit the candle and set it carefully on the piano, where its light fell flickering, wavering over her worn young face. And who shall say she was not a messenger from another world to this man who had long trodden the downward path? They were interrupted, however, before this song was finished, by a newcomer who entered like a shadow and stood at the end of the piano, looking wonderingly from Shirley to the man. When she glanced up, she stopped, startled, for although he wore no brass buttons nor blue clothes, she was quite sure those were the same gray eyes that had looked at her from the recess of the window in the government office that afternoon. Perhaps the same boy who had come after her car and sent her off on this long way into the wilderness. The man Sam straightened up suddenly and looked about him half ashamed with an apologetic grin. "Oh, you've come, have you, Henny? Well, you've been a long time about it. But now I guess we'll get to work. Where's Joe? Out on the watch? All right then, miss, if you've no objection, we'll just take a little vacation on the psalm singing and turn our attention to worldly things. I calculate you're sharp enough to know what we brought you here for. I acknowledge you can sing real well, and you sort of got my goat for a while with all that morning bench tra-la-la, for you certainly have got the holy dope down fine, but now the time's come for business. And you needn't to think that because I can enjoy a little sentiment now and then in a leisure moment, that you can put anything over on me, for it can't be did. I mean business, and I've got you in my power. We're 10 miles from any settlement, and no neighbors anywhere about. Everybody's moved away, so it won't do no good to work any funny business on us. You can't get away. We're all armed, and no one knows where you are. If you just behave yourself and do as you're told, there won't be any trouble. We'll just transact our business, and then we'll have a bit of supper and maybe a few more tunes. Got any ragtime in your repertoire? And then, sometime after midnight, when the moon's good and dark, we'll get you back to civilization where you won't have no trouble in getting home. But if you act up and get funny, why, you know what to expect. There was a young girl murdered once in this house and buried in the cellar, and ever since, folks say it's haunted, and they won't come near it. That's the kind of place we're in. So now are you ready?" Shirley sat cold and still. It seemed as if her life-blood had suddenly congealed in her veins, and for a second she felt as if her senses were going to desert her. Then the echo of her own song, "Hide me, O my Saviour, hide," seemed to cry out from her soul silently, and she rallied once more and gained her self-control. "Well, miss," went on the man impressively, "I see you're ready for the question, and you've got your nerve with you, too. I'll hand you that. But I warn you it won't do no good. We brung you out here to get a hold of that notebook you wrote in this morning, and we're going to have it. We know that Mr. Barnard left it in your care. Henny here heard him say for you to keep it, so it won't be of any use for you to lie about it." "Of course," said Shirley, standing up and reaching over for her handbag, which she had laid on the piano beside her while she played. "I understand perfectly, but I'd like to ask you a question, Mr.
Smith or Jones, whatever you like to call it, spit it out."
"I suppose you are paid to bring me out here, Mr. Smith, and get my property away from me?" she said gravely.
"Well, yes. We don't calculate to do it for just sweet charity."
"And I am paid to look after my notebook, you see. It's a trust that has been given me. I just have to look after it. It's out of the question for me to desert it." Shirley spoke coolly and held her little bag close in the firm grasp of her two hands. The man stared at her and laughed. The boy Henny fairly gaped in his astonishment. A girl with all that nerve! Of course I understand perfectly that you can murder me and bury me down in the cellar beside that other girl that was murdered, and perhaps no one will find it out for a good while, and you can go on having a good time on the money you'll get for it. But the day will come when you will have to answer for it. You know I didn't come here alone today." Both men looked startled and glanced uneasily into the shadows, as if there might be someone lurking there. "God came with me, and He knows, and He'll make you remember some day." The boy laughed out a nervous ha-ha of relief, but the man seemed held, fascinated by her look and words. There was silence for a second, while the girl held off the ruffian in the man by sheer force of her strong personality. Then the boy laughed again, with a sneer at the end of it, and the spell was broken. The leer came into the eyes of the man again. The sneer of the boy had brought him to himself, to the self he had come to be. "Nix on the sob stuff, girlie," he said gruffly. "It won't go down with me. We're here for business, and we've been delayed too long already. Come now, will you hand out that notebook, or will we have to search you?" He took one stride across to where she stood and wrenched the handbag from her grasp before she was aware of his intention. She had not meant to give it up without a struggle, much as she loathed the thought of one. She must make the matter last as long as possible, if perchance God was sending help to her, and must contest every inch of the way as far as lay in her power. Oh, had anyone picked up her cards? Had the book with its message reached any friendly eye? Frail and white and stern she stood, with folded arms, while they turned out the contents of the little bag and scattered it over the piano, searching with clumsy fingers among her dainty things. The notebook she had rolled within her handkerchiefs and made it hard to find. She feared lest her ruse would be discovered when they looked it over. The boy was the one who clutched for the little book, recognizing it as the one he had seen in the office that morning. The man hung over his shoulder and peered in the candlelight, watching the boy anxiously. It meant a good deal of money if they put this thing through. "Here it is," said the boy, fluttering through the leaves and carefully scrutinizing the shorthand characters. "Yes, that's the dope." He ran his eye down the pages, caught a word here and there. Technicalities of manufacture, the very items, of course, that he wanted, if this had been the specifications for the government order. Shirley remembered with relief that none of the details were identical, however, with the notes she carried in her shoes. The book notes were, in fact, descriptive of an entirely different article from that demanded by the government. The question was, would these people be wise enough to discover that fact before she was out of their power or not? Furtively she studied the boy. There was something keen and cunning about his youthful face. He was thick-set, with blonde hair and blue eyes. He had a bulldog chin, a retreating forehead, and an eagle nose. Shirley saw all this as she studied him furtively. That he was an expert in shorthand was proved by the ease with which he read some of her obscure sentences, translating rapidly here and there as he examined the book. Was he well enough informed about the government contract to realize that these were not the notes she had taken in the office that morning? And, should he fail to recognize it, was there perhaps someone higher in authority to whom they would be shown before she was released? She shivered and set her weary toes tight with determination over the little crinkling pages in her shoes. Somehow, she would protect those notes from being taken, even if she had to swallow them. There surely would be a way to hide them if the need came. Suddenly, the tense strain in which she was holding herself was broken by the boy. He looked up with a grin. He handed the pages to Sam, who said, "That's all right, girlie, that's the dope we want. Now we won't trouble you any longer. We'll have supper. Henny, you go get some of that wood out in the shed. We'll have a fire on the hearth and make some coffee." But Shirley, standing white and tense in the dim shadow of the room, suddenly felt the place whirling about her, and the candle dancing afar off. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she dropped back to the piano stool weakly, and covered her face with her hands, pressing hard on her eyeballs, trying to keep her senses and stop this black dizziness that threatened to submerge her consciousness. She must not faint, if this was fainting. She must keep her senses and guard her precious shoes. If one of those should fall off while she was unconscious, all would be undone. Chapter 25. The man looked up from the paper he was twisting for a fire, and saw Shirley's attitude of despair. "Say, kid," he said, with a kind of gruff tenderness, "you don't need to take it that way. I know it's tough luck to lose out when you've been so nervy and all, but you knew we had it over you from the start. You hadn't a show, and say, girlie, I tell you what, I'll make Henny sit right down now and copy 'em off for you, and you can put 'em in your book right now, and when you get back, nobody'll be the wiser. We'll just take out the leaves. We gotta keep the original, of course, but that won't make any beans for you. It won't take you no time to write 'em over again if he gives you a copy." Somehow it penetrated through Shirley's tired consciousness that the man was trying to be kind to her. He was pitying her and offering a way out of her supposed dilemma, offering to assist her in some of his own kind of deception. The girl was touched even through all her other crowding emotions and weariness. She lifted up her head with a faint little smile. "Thank you," she said wearily, "but that wouldn't do me any good." "Why not?" asked the man sharply. "Your boss'd never know it got out through you." "But I should know I had failed," she said sadly. "If you had my notes, I should know that I had failed in my trust." "It wouldn't be your fault. You couldn't have helped it." "Oh, yes, I could, and I ought. I shouldn't have let the driver turn around. I should have got out of that car and waited at the station as Mr. Barnard told me to do till he came. I had been warned, and I ought to have been on my guard. So you see it was my fault." She dropped her head forward and rested her chin dejectedly on the palm of her hand, her elbow on her knee. The man stood looking at her for a second in half-indignant astonishment. "By golly," he said at last, "you certainly are some nut. Well, anyhow, buck up and let's have some tea. Sorry I can't see my way clear to help you out any further, being as we're sort of partners in this job, and you certainly have got some nerve for a girl. But you know how it is. I guess I can't do no more'n I said. I got my honor to think about, too, see? Henny, get a move on. We ain't waitin' all night for eats. Bring in them things from the cupboard and let's get to work." Shirley declined to come to the table when at last the repast was ready. She said she was not hungry. In fact, the smell of the crackers and cheese and pickles and dried beef sickened her. She felt too hysterical to try to eat, and besides, she had a lingering feeling that she must keep near that piano. If anything happened, she had a vague idea that she might somehow hide the precious notes within the big old instrument. The man frowned when she declined to come to supper, but a moment later stumbled awkwardly across the room with a slopping cup of coffee and set it down beside her. "Buck up, girlie," he growled. "Drink that and you'll feel better." Shirley thanked him and tried to drink a few mouthfuls. Then the thought occurred to her that it might be drugged, and she swallowed no more. But she tried to look a bit brighter. If she must pass this strange evening in the company of these rough men, it would not help matters for her to give way to despair. So after toying with the teaspoon a moment, she put the cup down and began to play soft airs on the old piano again, while the men ate, and took a stealthy taste now and then from a black bottle. She watched them furtively as she played, marveling at their softened expressions, remembering the old line, "Music hath charms to soothe the savage breast," and wondering if perhaps there were not really something in it. If she had not been in such a terrifying situation, she would really have enjoyed the character study that this view of those two faces afforded her, as she sat in the shadow playing softly, while they ate with the flaring candle between them. "I like music with my meals," suddenly chanted out the boy in an interval. But the man growled in a low tone, "Shut up! Ain't you got no manners?" Shirley prolonged that meal as much as music could do for it, for she had no relish for a more intimate tete-a-tete with either of her companions. When she saw them grow restless, she began to sing again, light little airs this time with catchy words, or old tender melodies of home and mother and childhood. They were songs she had sung that last night in the dear old barn, when Sidney Graham and Elizabeth were with them, and unconsciously her voice took on the wail of her heart for all that dear past, so far away from her now. Suddenly, as the last tender note of a song died away, Joe stumbled breathlessly into the room. The boy Henny slithered out of the room like a serpent at his first word. "Beat it!" he cried in a hoarse whisper. "Get a move on! All hell's after us! I'll bet they heard her singin'! Take her and beat it! I'll douse the fire and out the candle." He seized a full bucket of water and dashed it over the dying fire. Shirley felt the other man grasp her arm in a firm grip. Then Joe snuffed out the candle with his broad thumb and finger, and all was pitch dark. She felt herself dragged across the floor regardless of furniture in the way, stumbling, choking with fear, her one thought that whatever happened, she must not let her slippers get knocked off. Holding her feet in a tense strain with every muscle extended to keep the shoes fastened on like a vice. She was haunted with a wild thought of how she might have slipped under the piano and eluded her captor, if only the light had gone out 1 second sooner before he reached her side. But it was too late to think of that now, and she was being dragged along breathlessly, out the front door perhaps, and down a walk. No, it was amongst trees, for she almost ran into one. The man swore at her, grasped her arm until he hurt her, and she cried out. "You shut up or I'll shoot you," he said with an oath. He had lost all his suavity, and there was desperation in his voice. He kept turning his head to look back and urging her on. She tripped on a root and stumbled to her knees, bruising them painfully. But her only thought was one of joy that her shoes had not come off. The man swore a fearful oath under his breath, then snatched her up and began to run with her in his arms. It was then that she heard Graham's voice calling, "Shirley, where are you? I'm coming." She thought she was swooning or dreaming, and that it was not really he, for how could he possibly be here? But she cried out with a voice as clear as a bell, "I'm here, Sidney! Come quick!" In his efforts to hush her voice, the man stumbled and fell with her in his arms. There came other voices and forms through the night. She was gathered up in strong, kind arms and held. The last thought she had, before she sank into unconsciousness, was that God had not forgotten. He had been remembering all the time, and sent his help before it was too late, just as she had known all along he must do, because he had promised to care for his own, and she was one of his little ones. When she came to herself again, she was lying in Sidney Graham's arms, with her head against his shoulder, feeling, oh, so comfortable and tired. There were 2 automobiles with powerful headlights standing between the trees, and a lot of policemen in the shadowy background. Her captor stood sullen against a tree, with his hands and feet shackled. Joe stood between 2 policemen with a rope bound around his body spirally, and the boy Henny, also bound, beside his fallen bicycle. He turned his ferret eyes from side to side, as if he hoped even yet to escape. 2 other men with hawk-like faces that she had not seen before were there also, manacled, and with eyes of smoldering fires. Climbing excitedly out of one of the big cars came Mr. Barnard, his usually immaculate pink face smutty and weary, his sparse white hair rumpled giddily, and a worried pucker on his kind, prim face. "Oh, my dear Miss Hollister, how unfortunate!" he exclaimed.
I do hope you haven't suffered from too much inconvenience."
Shirley smiled up at him from her shoulder of refuge, as from a dream. It was all so amusing and impossible after what she had been through. It couldn't be real.
"I assure you I am very much distressed on your account," went on Mr. Barnard, politely and hurriedly. "And I hate to mention it at such a time, but could you tell me whether those notes are safe? Did those horrid men get anything away from you?"
A sudden flicker of triumph passed over the faces of the fettered man and the boy, like a ripple over still water. But Shirley's voice rippled forth in a glad, clear laugh as she answered joyously, "Yes, Mr. Barnard, they got my notebook, but not the notes. They thought the Tilman Brooks notes were what they were after, but the real notes are in my shoes. Won't you please get them out? For I'm afraid I can't hold them on any longer. My feet ache so." It is a pity that Shirley was not in a position to see the look of astonishment, followed by a twinkle of actual appreciation, that came over the face of the shackled man beside the tree as he listened. One could almost fancy he was saying to himself, "The nervy little nut! She put one over on me after all." It was also a pity that Shirley could not have got the full view of the altogether precise and conventional Mr. Barnard, kneeling before her on the ground, removing carefully, with deep embarrassment and concern, first one, then the other of her little black pumps, extracting the precious notes, counting over the pages, and putting them ecstatically into his pocket. No one of that group but Shirley could fully appreciate the ludicrous picture he made.
"You're entirely sure that no one but yourself has seen these notes?"
he asked anxiously, as if he hardly dared to believe the blessed truth. "Entirely sure, Mr. Barnard," said Shirley happily. "And now, if you wouldn't mind putting on my shoes again, I can relieve Mr. Graham of the necessity of carrying me any further."
"Oh, surely, surely," said Mr. Barnard,
quite fussed, and getting down laboriously again, his white forelock all tossed, and his forehead perplexed over the unusual task. How did women get into such a little trinket of a shoe, anyhow?
"I assure you, Miss Hollister, our firm appreciates what you have done. We shall not forget it. You will see we shall not forget it," he puffed, as he rose with beads of perspiration on his brow. "You have done a great thing for Barnard and Clegg today." "She's done more than that," said a burly policeman, significantly glancing around the group of sullen prisoners, as Graham put her upon her feet beside him. "She's rounded up the whole gang for us, and that's more than anybody else has been able to do yet. She ought to get a medal of some kind for that." Then, with a daredevil lift of his head, and a gleam of something like fun in his sullen eyes, the manacled man by the tree spoke out, looking straight at Shirley, real admiration in his voice. "I say, pard, I guess you're the winner. I'll hand you what's coming to you if I do lose. You certainly had your nerve."
Shirley looked at him with a kind of compassion in her eyes. I'm sorry you have to be there," she finished. "You were as fine as you could be to me under the circumstances, I suppose. I thank you for that." The man met her gaze for an instant, a flippant reply upon his lips, but checked it and dropped his eyes, and was silent. The whole little company under the trees were hushed into silence before the miracle of a girl's pure spirit, leaving its impress on a blackened soul. Then quietly, Graham led her away to his car, with Barnard and the detectives following. The prisoners were loaded into the other cars and hurried on the way to judgment. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the Enchanted Barn. Please let me know how you like this story, and make suggestions for others you'd like to hear. I'll talk to you again soon.